Hello, welcome to a panel of the Modern Japan History Association, MJHA, on ninja and samurai. I'm very excited to have everybody here. We have today three excellent panelists who did very exciting work on the topic, the historical ninja and samurai and their mythology around them. I teach every year in Penn State a course on the samurai, and that led me, like a lot of us, I guess, here in the panel, to think a lot about this connection between the historical figures of the samurai and not so much of the ninja, but we're going to talk about that, and the mythology around them. And today, we're gonna really dive right into the history and the myth around the ninja and the samurai, and also the way we can teach it. Because I think a lot of our students come to us because of those mythologies that we are almost obliged to dismantle. But the big question that I will have for the panel is, should we? So without further ado, I'm going to open it up. So today, Polina Barducci is going to go first, followed by Rob, Tak, and then Oleg Benesch. So Polina, are you ready?
Okay, thank you everyone for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk to you about this very controversial topic in pre-modern history. So in this talk, I will outline the problematic aspects of doing research on the origins of the ninja in the history of the 16th and the 17th centuries. As with any phenomenon of popular culture, one must both deconstruct the popular narrative and also reconstruct its origins to see its traces in the historical documents. Previously, Mikael Adolfsson has demonstrated that in his work on the history of Sohei, the monastic warriors, who were not all necessarily monks or whose right to violence was quite divorced from religiosity. The popular origin story of the ninja is also deeply intertwined with the ideas of spirituality and self-cultivation, but those are often retrospective inventions. When we look at primary accounts of the late 16th century, a time period to which all ninjutsu-related literature is pointing as the cradle of this art of disguise, we do not see the ninja clearly. Instead, we see a variety of terms such as suppa, dappa, kusa, kamari, which were then retrospectively tied together under the umbrella term shinobi by the famous Edo nativist Hanawa Hokinoichi, who lived in the late 18th century. Whereas in the 16th century, shinobu was a verb that meant to sneak in, a very common military tactic of guerrilla warfare which was employed during the sieges of castles. So nowadays, whenever scholars say that they found the evidence of ninjas entering the castle of Oda Nobunaga, very often they end up misreading the word shinobu, to sneak in, as a substantive, shinobi, someone who sneaks in. So in short, many people in battles were sneaking in, almost everyone was doing the shinobi. The skill itself was highly valued, but it wasn't monopolized by a group of specialized forces. The tactics of ambush and counter ambush were developed within the powerful warrior families, such as the Gohojo or the Date. I discuss it more in details in the article that I co-authored with Denny Orbach, who's also present here today. So, if military tactics are not the answer to our quest of who the ninja were, then what is? Perhaps it is another trope of the ninja law, the liminality of one's status. And again, he will look to the Edo scholars. Someone called Ogasawara Sakun, who lived in the late 17th century and was an author of many manuals on warrior etiquette, wrote in one of his pieces called A Collection on Military Law for the Samurai. He's writing about the descendants from Iga and Koka, who are now considered to be the main representatives of the ninja tradition. And he believes them to be very skilled in larceny. Larceny, he argues, is an important skill for warfare, but of course, due to ethical reasons, there may not be any thieves serving the daimyo, the lords of the domains. Therefore, the lords have to hire the descendants of Iga and Koka to use their unworthy tactics to succeed in battle. In other words, in the late 17th century, the ninja with their disruptive warfare methods could not fit in the ideological paradigm of peace and stability of the Pax Tokugawa. And yet their skills were seen as incredibly useful, especially in suppressing rebellions against the Tokugawa supremacy. We have documented evidence of how important the deployment of the ninja as infiltrating spy was for quelling various rebellions, such as the Shimabara rebellion of Christian warriors in 1637. Ironically, the disruptive tactics were needed to eliminate the disruptors. So I see the Ogasawara's description of the ninja as an attempt to find a compromise between the liminal nature of disruptive ninja activities and the utility of the mercenary services to the daimyo. This is essentially how the ninja began to be associated with the shadows of society in the popular early modern discourse on warfare and martial arts. So, in the age of peace, the ninja could only stay in the shadows. But what about the age of war? Was there a distinction between regular troops and these men skilled in larceny, arson, ambush, and night attacks? How did the people who were skilled in the art of shinobi relate to the warriors, to the samurai? The short answer to that is Sengoku warlords had a very hard time with anyone engaged in shinobi, regardless of whether they were fighting against them or together with them. In our co-authored article, I discuss how the Gohojo warlords were struggling to control the squad of someone called Kazama Kotaro, who in the later periods was revered as one of the forefathers of the ninja law. The historical Kazama and his men were very useful in the acts of sabotage, but the problem was that after the battle, they would still continue to pillage the nearby villages, and now the villages that belong to the Gohojo. So we see in documents that there was definitely a distinction between the men mostly engaged in the guerrilla warfare and the warriors under the direct vassalage of the Gohojo generals. More examples of a distinction in status can be seen in the charters of Iga and Koka leagues. So Iga and Koka leagues were two confederations of self-governed villages, towns, small landowners, and wealthy farmers, and they were located on the Kii Peninsula. So this is modern-day Wakayama Prefecture and Mie Prefecture. Later on, the descendants of Iga and Koka men became known as the original ninja. However, in the Sengoku period, the documents do not show any ninja. So the Iga League issued charters in 1569, and we see that actually it was the foot soldiers, Ashigaru, who were responsible for besieging castles. Moreover, if a foot soldier of the Iga League was very successful in his activities in the nearby lands and was able to recruit more peasants, hyakusho, to pledge allegiance to the League, such a foot soldier would be promoted to the status of samurai. In a neighboring league, the Koka League, whenever there would be a mobilization to protect the land, the self-governing body of the league would not only recruit peasants, but everyone up to the level of hall monks, doso. Those were selected from top-tier learned monks, not to be confused with the doshu, which were mid-level administrative clergy. So speaking of these hall monks being recruited to fight, we should remember that Iga and Koka districts had a high concentration of yamabushi, monastic practitioners of Shugendo, who had their own intelligence networks and often engaged in warfare to protect their land rights. This area was also home to the powerful religious establishments on Mount Koyasan, that were notorious for having ranking monks serve as ringleaders in brawls over land. So, and as evidenced by the Koka Charter that I was talking about, some of these monastic practitioners, quite high-ranking, were also associated with the self-governing leagues and would fight on their behalf. I really like the source because incidentally, we just can see the origin of two greatest myths of pre-modern Japan, the ninja and the sohei, the monastic warrior. But coming back to Iga and Korka, unfortunately, the social structure of the leagues is not very well documented, given that this was an age with no monopoly on violence held by a certain group. The history of the dissolution of the two leagues as the self-governing bodies actually sheds more light on who became the ninja spies in the Tokugawa period. So, a diary account from a monk who lived in the 16th century in Kofukuji says that Toyotomi Hideyoshi's policy on separating peasants from warriors displaced a lot of samurai in Korka. So they were forced essentially to either become peasants or ronin, right? A masterless warrior, or in this case, you can even say a landless warrior. And many of them opted for the latter and fled into the mountains. Later on, Tokugawa Ieyasu recruited these men from the former Korka League as the Korka men, who now became providers of intelligence services and guerrilla warfare for the Tokugawa service, but on a regular basis. Ironically, the Korka men became closer to the image of the ninja that we know today only when they became the vassals of the Tokugawa. In conclusion, to find the ninja in the Sengoku period, we must first deconstruct the image created by the Tokugawa scholars. It is tightly connected to the discourse of peace and stability, as the ninja became the authority-sanctioned warriors of liminal status. Conversely, in the war-torn 16th century, anyone could fit the description of the ninja and engage in guerrilla warfare. Peasants, foot soldiers, small landowners of samurai status, and even practicing monks. Regrettably, looking at martial arts does not forward research on who these people were. Rather, as with any pre-modern phenomenon, one should look at their relationship to land, community, and governance. Thank you.
So Rand's brief for this was to create what he called a provocation, I think was the term that he used in terms of making the points here. And my provocation is this: when it comes to the ninja, I think we've been doing it wrong. The majority of what we've written on the topic has taken a historical perspective, right? It's treating the ninja as an historical construct and a topic that we can address through documentary historical research. Now, that works. There's nothing wrong with that. But I want to argue that this approach is always going to be limited because it doesn't fully grasp what the ninja phenomenon is. My argument, my provocation, is that we should understand the ninja essentially as a form of historical fiction. Because what ninja history in practice often does is exactly what historical fiction does. It takes real events and individuals and it mixes them up with completely fictional ones. Now, what's unusual about ninja history in practice, and by here I mean mostly across the course of the 20th century, and what catches a lot of people off guard, is that it doesn't acknowledge that that is what it's doing. It tends to present itself as history in a perhaps more popular, but still essentially the same thing as academic history. And I think this tends to catch academic readers out as well when they approach, or if they approach, the ninja literature, mostly because we don't have a good mental model for thinking about this kind of thing, right? I mean, we know what historical fiction is, right? We take real events, it's Shogun on Hulu or whatever. We take real historical events and we weave fictional things and people in that. That's no problem. We know about that. We have a variety of approaches for dealing with that. What we don't have a model for dealing with is literal fiction being presented as history. And the reason we don't have a model for that is because it's simply not supposed to happen, right? This is just not supposed to be something that is going on. But I want to make the case here that this happens all the time in modern ninja history, and it's actually arguably a central methodology. It's a core pillar of how a great deal of what has been written on the topic of the ninja in the 20th century has come into being. So let me give a couple of specific examples just to illustrate my point. So the book I have in my hand right now, hopefully everyone can see this, is entitled Ninja, the Invisible Assassin. So this was published in 1970 by an American journalist by the name of Andrew Adams. Now, I would wager a reasonable sum of money that nobody here has heard of this book, but it was incredibly influential. Between 1970 and 2008, it went through 36 editions. And if anybody here has published a book that's gone through 36 editions, I will be extremely impressed. It's incredibly influential. It's in the bibliography of essentially every author who's written on the topic of the ninja ever since. Unfortunately, The Invisible Assassins as a work of serious history is a disaster. And the main reason for this is that Adams was not able to consistently distinguish between historical and fictional events and individuals. The best example of this, I mean, there are several, but the best example is his inclusion, apparently as historical fact, of an attempt by Ishikawa Goemon, famous thief from the late Warring States period, to kill the warlord Oda Nobunaga by dripping poison down a thread into his mouth as he slept. Now, some of you may actually have come across this because it's a hugely iconic assassination technique. It was reprised in the 1967 James Bond film You Only Live Twice, and plenty of other venues ever since. I have a little collection of these all myself just for my own amusement. And it never happened. It's complete fiction. What Adams is actually describing in his book is the climactic scene of a 1962 Japanese ninja movie called Shinobi no Mono, which in turn borrowed the poison thread technique from a 1925 novel by the author Edogawa Ranpo, which in turn borrowed that from an 1892 Sherlock Holmes novel. So it's fiction all the way down, and yet it's been consistently represented in the English language ninja literature as a real historical event. As recently as 2019, it appears as something that actually happened. And I think that the failure to grasp this, the fact that a lot of alleged ninja history is literally fictional, is a real problem. It's left English language readers in particular with a whole shelves and shelves of books that are completely unreliable as history. And it's tempting maybe to ascribe this just to sloppiness, right? That this is a question of writers failing to check their sources. And it is that. But I also want to argue that it's the fiction as history thing is an emergent phenomenon that reflects a deeper assumption about ninja history in Japan as well. And the assumption is this, that fictional works can always be treated as historical sources. And the point of origin for this, I think, comes in the Meiji period during Japan's process of modernization. And I think you can trace it back to a range of connected discourses such as hypnosis, modern notions of psychology and the like, all of which are used to explain essentially what really happened in pre-modern Japanese texts, right? So accounts of magic and the supernatural in the modern period, hypnosis, psychology, etc., are used to explain that these actually happened and that they were hypnosis or delusions or whatever. So let's say, for instance, we have a 1666 story about a wizard who appears to swallow a cow, right? This is from Otogi Boko, a collection by Asai Ryoi. Someone points out he hasn't actually swallowed the cow, right? So the wizard gets annoyed at this. He causes a morning glory plant to grow in a matter of seconds, grabs one of the gourds, cuts it in half, and the heckler's head falls off. Okay, that's basically the story here. And the ninja writer insists this happened, right? This actually happened. It's just that it was done by hypnosis, right? That the magician must have used magical, mass hypnosis to make the crowd think that this happened. And that's essentially a very sort of crude example for how fictional tales end up being transposed into historical sources. The fact that this is part of a Setsuwa collection, that the story itself is derived from two earlier Chinese tales of the supernatural, is generally ignored. Instead, the argument basically is that this tale of supernatural power must be in some way a depiction of things that actually happen. And obviously that's an extremely dubious assumption, but the idea that there's always some kind of historical core to any sort of textual account, any historical, any sort of account of something happening, becomes really a central plank of a great deal of ninja history. If you want a more mundane example, and I must stress, by the way, that this ethic of reading, if we call this, is not only applied to Edo period texts, it's also applied even to modern Japanese media. And a great example of this is the famous shuriken, right? The star-shaped ninja Death Star that is inseparable from the idea of the ninja, right? It's the icon of the ninja. Now, it's been known for a while that there is essentially no historical evidence for the proposition that historical shinobi used star-shaped throwing weapons. But more recent scholarship coming out of Japan, this is from the Mie University Ninja Research Center, has suggested that the point of origin for the idea that ninja use star-shaped shuriken is very likely a 1957 samurai movie called the Yagyu Warrior Scrolls, right? Yagyu Bugecho. And essentially, what happens in the movie, we have characters identified as ninja. They use star-shaped throwing weapons. That then seems to have been taken up and absorbed into ninja lore. And for the next 60 years or so, was presented as a strong historical claim, right? That ninja used star-shaped throwing weapons. I'd be certain that everybody here has heard of this claim. It's endured for almost more than 70 years at this point. So hopefully you see what I mean when I suggest that we're on, in some ways, firmer ground, or at least it's more productive to approach the notion of the ninja as a highly unusual form of historical fiction, right? I mean, not only are a number of the specific historical claims in ninja discourse literally fictional, they're not even from Edo period fiction exclusively. I mean, it's not that unusual for 60s movies to end up somehow being presented as things that actually happened. So I guess that's my provocation. I'll end it there and I'll pass it over to Oleg. Thank you.
I mean, as some people may be aware, Ron mentioned this earlier as well, especially people based in the UK, that this spring the British Museum hosted a major exhibition on the samurai. And I've been working on this exhibition for the past 5 years together with Rosina Buckland, who's the curator of the Japanese collections at the museum. And as part of this, we put together also kind of an international research team of more than 20 scholars working on many different aspects of representations of the samurai. And we've just published the first 11 articles from this research project in a special issue of Japan Review titled Global Samurai. We're currently working on a second special issue. It'll hopefully come out later this year. And this research project also fed into the exhibition design and the exhibition book. And I mentioned these things not just to, plug these publications, especially the open access articles, because this experience has really impacted a lot of my views on the samurai legacy in Japan and around the world, a subject which I recently realized that I've been working on for almost 25 years. It was a bit distressing. I'm still thinking through many of the things I've learned in this process, especially over the last few years, and the exhibition ending last week has finally or hopefully given me a bit of time to actually do sort of think about that. And this roundtable is really great timing for me in that regard. And in terms of the things we're discussing today, although we ended up having a very large exhibition, there were many things that we were unable to include or give the coverage that they deserve. I mean, we're trying to cover, almost 1,000 years of history here. One of the things we couldn't include was castles, but I'll leave that to one side here. But more significantly for today's discussion were the ninja and martial arts, both of which kind of featured only tangentially in the exhibition, also due to the fact that it can be difficult to represent these things with objects that kind of have the wow factor for the general public. That is the museum visitor and what the museum would like to put in. There are a lot of cooks making the broth in an exhibition like this. But for myself, someone who was trained primarily as an intellectual historian, the exhibition allowed me to work closely with some fantastic scholars from other disciplines. I mean, especially Rosina as an art historian. And as became very clear when Ron and I were working on modern history of Japanese castles, chronologies and legacies look very different depending on the types of sources we use. I mean, then especially when we get into art, literature, and material culture, I mean, including buildings. But as an intellectual historian, a lot of my early work was focused on the reinvention of the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, as a symbol of modern Japanese national identity, kind of from the 1890s onward. And when we're looking at textual sources, it's clear that, while the term Bushido is found sporadically in early modern texts, the concept is largely a construct of the late Meiji period, even if it's then projected back onto early modern and pre-modern Japan by various intellectuals and ideologists in the 20th century. And I mean, I've argued that it's precisely the lack of widespread pre-modern use of the word Bushido that makes it suitable for appropriation for almost any means in the modern period and really contributes to its broad dissemination and adoption. In contrast, when we look at the samurai more broadly, it's clear that representations and image making were incredibly important from the very earliest times. And, this image making drew heavily on, certain famous battles and heroes, which are heavily idealized and fictionalized. They become staples of both kind of high culture and popular culture from the medieval period to the present day. And already from a very early stage in the history of Japanese warriors, there was a pronounced nostalgia for a supposed golden age of kind of martial masculinity that was located at some point in the past, and this past could vary. We see this, for example, in kind of the large battle armors of the late Heian type that are kind of then being reproduced and collected centuries after the use on the actual battlefield. And at the same time, as kind of our ongoing collaborative research project on global samurai shows, representations of the samurai in Japan were heavily influenced by engagements with other countries and societies, from Confucian and Buddhist thought coming to Japan, to the Mongol invasions, to the arrival of the Europeans and Christianity. And meanwhile, the samurai had a major impact on views of Japan around the world, through the movement of people, such as the Japanese communities established in Southeast Asia around 1600, to the Japanese missions to Europe, to the devastating invasions of Korea in the 1590s. And all of these complex factors fed into the evolution of various samurai images in Japan and elsewhere in the early modern period, when exchange between Japan and other countries was sharply curtailed. Now, following the unification of the country under the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century and the gradual establishment of peace in the subsequent decades, interest in martial culture grew and spread throughout all levels of society. For the samurai themselves, being a defined hereditary class for the first time kind of in their history in a period of peace meant that they sought to clarify their identity and purpose. And for this, they often looked back to the earlier ages of conflict. For commoners, samurai tales became increasingly accessible through theater, books, woodblock prints, storytelling, as all of these different things thrived. Samurai were themselves, they're exhorted to learn and practice martial arts, and the function of these often bore similarities with modern sports, as Mike Wirth, who's in the audience here, and others have shown in their work. And in the mid-19th century, as the Tokugawa order then started facing increasing pressure from Western empires, martial arts and strategy took on a new urgency. There are many calls for samurai to focus on these skills, but at the same time, many people are lamenting the ineffectiveness and essentially obsolescence of the samurai and criticizing their supposed decline from ancient ideals. After the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1867 and the gradual abolition of samurai status and privileges over the course of the following decade, the former warrior class are widely seen as kind of a relic of the feudal past, both in Japan and by foreign observers. Nonetheless, there's also a fascination with samurai objects in Europe and America. Literally tons of swords and armor are being purchased by collectors, and these bulk buys still make up the core of many private and public collections of samurai material around the world today. And that Western appreciation of samurai material culture, if not quite yet the samurai themselves, could also be seen in the efforts to protect Japanese castles, for example, many of which experienced large-scale dismantling and demolition in the 1870s. These narratives then start to shift in the 1890s, especially after Japan's victory over China in 1895, kind of leads people around the world to seek to better understand Japan. And Japan's new military strength naturally leads to an interest in martial ideals. And it's at this time that Japanese thinkers first proposed Bushido as a modern national ethic modeled on the knightly virtue and gentlemanship that they encountered as part of the Victorian chivalric revival. This process then accelerates during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-05, with Bushido being widely credited for Japan's success and also kind of becoming a state-supported ideology in Japan and a household word really around the world at that time. Meanwhile, the samurai also became a global icon for the first time. They're inspiring anti-colonial movements, political reformers, even the Boy Scouts. And this is also an early example of soft power, as Japanese judo and jujitsu instructors are spreading these martial arts in many different societies. They're ultimately training British suffragettes, they're training President Teddy Roosevelt and his daughter, they're inspiring Brazilian jiu-jitsu and other fighting styles. And then over the decades until the end of the Second World War, the image and popularity of the samurai shifts considerably, depending also on the international and kind of diplomatic order. And as Japanese imperialism in Asia expanded in the 1930s and caused greater conflict with Britain and the United States, the supposed samurai legacy came to be seen as a cause of Japan's aggression in those countries. Whereas in contrast, in Germany and Italy, the samurai image was viewed ever more positively. And we have several articles in the Japan Review special issues looking at views of the samurai in other countries and societies around the world. Now, following the rejection of samurai symbols in Japan and other countries after defeat in 1945, and then the banning of martial arts and other kind of militaristic culture by the US occupation, the samurai gradually came back into popular acceptance in the 1950s through kind of several different spheres. And one of these is the reconstruction of Japanese castles as tourism and heritage sites, which are celebrating Japan's pre-Meiji history, kind of especially in the context of local pride. Another sphere is the martial arts, which, in spite of the occupation ban, remained popular in Japan and actually also among US military personnel, especially karate, and also practitioners around the world. You can see this in the inclusion of judo in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, for example. The other area, or another area, is popular culture, which, in Japan, popular culture on samurai includes literature, manga, and film. In other countries, this is initially represented especially by samurai films. I don't want to take up too much time going through the history of samurai popular culture in the last 60 years, but I just want to highlight a significant shift in the early 21st century, which is exemplified by the film The Last Samurai as a key moment. This film, as well as later media such as the 2025 Shogun remake, that series, or the video games, Ghost of Tsushima, Assassin's Creed Shadows, and others, all these things have been produced not by Japanese studios, but by Western studios creating Japanese content. And in this sense, a century on from the Russo-Japanese War, the samurai have once again, become a truly global icon and are being used, often completely detached from Japan. And in this context, I want to mention just kind of one final thing, which is a potentially part of a provocation, but is also mainly just a reflection on the word samurai itself and how it's used in Japanese and other languages. In most languages, samurai is used as kind of a catch-all term for Japanese warriors across many centuries. In Japanese, the nearest equivalent term for this would be bushi, although this also has some slightly different usages. Samurai would traditionally have had much more specific meanings at various times. And, accordingly, historians of pre-modern Japan writing in Japanese tend not to use the term samurai outside of these specific contexts, and how it's relevant to the primary sources. I mean, furthermore, looking at the usages of the term, samurai in Japanese since the late 19th century, there's been a clear shift from writing it in kanji or hiragana to writing it in katakana. And this accelerates in the 1960s, and the word is now generally written in katakana, which I would argue reflects a widespread view of, samurai as a globally recognized figure, even like a pop culture icon, rather than something that is kind of authentically and purely located in Japanese history and tradition. But yeah, this is something I'm still working on, but I want to throw it out there for discussion, and I think I'll leave it at that.
So I want to open it up with a couple of questions that I will throw at the panels. I sent you guys three questions, but I think I'm just gonna put it into like one big one, which got to do with the reality and myth of the samurai, because this is the core of the issue. You can see all three talks about this connection between the mythology or the how to say inaccurate historical work done by Edo scholars and the self-mythology of the samurai and then how it goes globally and the historical reality and if it even matters. Because I want to ask you a general question, like, does it matter if we know the truth of the samurai and the ninja, but what do we have to look at? Because I teach a lot of ROTC, a lot of U.S. Army soldiers, and almost every time that, and I think we all have this experience. Every time that I ask people if they heard about Bushido or samurai, I will have one or two people who say, "Yes, I practice Bushido," in which I kind of cringe a bit, and then my first instinct will always be, "Let me deconstruct this whole thing and show you what is the real reality." But my question is this really the real way to go about it when you teach this stuff? and when you research this stuff, right? Should we deconstruct uh, the whole idea of Japanese warrior mind? Should we demolish the myth? And how do we can deal with our like inbred historical cynicism in a way that is constructive? Because a lot of our students come to us because they have this fascination with what we know is this heavily mythologized idea of ninja and samurai. Yet we need to deal with this. And this leads to my second, more broad question, right? So the first is about teaching myth and reality. The other one is I struggle to think about any other non-Western group of people, right? We have such a huge presence outside of the West, right? Both in terms of its popular culture, iconography, and martial art techniques. I don't see a lot of people practicing, African martial arts and the like. So I want to ask you again, first about teaching, and second about what this tells us, this global popularity of samurai ninja, what it tells us about Japan and the world, or you can do it any other way. So I'm just going to throw it at you.
Paulina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Actually, before answering to Rand's question, I wanted to say that on the topic of samurai not being used in sources, actually, I was also of this impression working on pre-modern warriors that it's buke or bushi. But this time round, preparing for our roundtable and looking at Iga and Korka charters, you clearly see that it says samurai, the kanji. So, I mean, obviously, in that sense, they mean samurai as ji-samurai, the small land owner that also has the capacity to go and defend his land. But I thought it was kind of interesting as well that actually we should not be so black and white about whether it's in primary sources or not. It's just it has a different meaning. Obviously, it doesn't. It's not. It's very much divorced from the samurai that we are discussing today. But as a historical term, it exists in primary sources. So just one small comment. And regarding Rand's questions, I think that there is no harm in enjoying the myth of either the samurai or the ninja, as long as we think of them as fiction, as Rob was talking about. I really love your approach that it should be considered a form of historical fiction. When you're talking about historical fiction, you don't just think of it in terms of, literary studies, but you also understand that it should not be confused with historical realities. And so if the student comes to you and says, oh, I want to do research on ninja or on samurai, you need to find out, I guess, as an instructor, whether they are interested more in the literary approach or in the historical approach, right? To what are they interested in? Because I think there are wonderful things to discover either way. And I also think that it is very important that museums and educating centers, whenever they use anything regarding ninjas or samurai, they should always give you both the popular narrative and then also talk about the historical realities, right? So that they can sort of satisfy our demand for the fantasy of the ninja, the fantasy of the samurai. But then we also see that in history, these were probably people of certain occupations. I mean, would knowing anything about ninja and how complicated and difficult it is to research it prevent me from enjoying a time in Ninja Kingdom in Mie Prefecture with my son? No, absolutely not. But again, I would really prefer them to add a little bit of historical disclaimers there, because we have responsibility to also educate people who are interested in the fantasy as well.
Yeah, Rob, you want to go?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, I come across this problem all the time. I've taught a course on Ninja 3 times now. Every time my students have accused me of trying to ruin Ninja for them. That's a direct quote, as it happens. But my rebuttal is, oh no, I'm not trying to do this at all. I'm actually trying to approach the phenomenon in a holistic way, right? The question, did ninja exist, which is the question I tend to get all the time, I'd say is the wrong question. I mean, I'm not sure we actually can answer this without defining what we mean by ninja, what we mean by exist, and probably what we mean by did as well, right? So the moment that you get into that particular question, it ceases to be a terribly useful jumping off point for analysis. My suggestion is that if you reorient this, and this is kind of the point of suggesting that we view the ninja as a form of historical fiction, if you ask the question instead, what is the phenomenon? What kind of discourses, what kind of media, what kind of phenomenon does it connect with? I mean, history obviously being one of those. That actually allows us to move in a whole variety of different directions that are often very interesting, right? Which add much more context to the overall thing. I'm into 1960s ninja novels, for instance, which, as far as I can tell, nobody has done any kind of research on at all, and yet they connect to the historical discourse just as much as any sort of documentary historical source. So I suppose that's my answer. That I'm trying to that I'm trying to kind of give a more holistic sense of what the ninja thing is, rather than just saying, oh, this is all nonsense. This is this is something we want to try and look at in a broader perspective. And yeah, I mean, I've had students who have been interested in Bushido as well. What I found sometimes happens is if I introduce them to say primary sources focusing on medieval warfare. For instance, right now I'm have almost finished translating Rai Sanyo's Nihon Gaishi, which has got tons and tons of accounts of medieval warfare. What often happens is they'll look at this and think, okay, well, I was under the impression that samurai never ran away or never surrendered. I can see that's nonsense, right? But now what I'm doing, essentially the students pivot, right? They kind of then decide, oh, okay, so the samurai was supremely practical. They did what it took to win. That's now me, right? That's now my understanding of Bushido. So it's maybe a bit more historically accurate. I'm not sure if it's necessarily better, but on the other hand, I mean, I think if a student interprets the idea of Bushido in terms of, say, discipline or focus or things like that, it's hard to see that that's harmful, but I don't know. I think the thing is that everyone interprets the idea differently, don't they? Right. And also, I mean, with regards to other groups, Kung Fu, maybe? I mean, the 1970s everybody was Kung Fu fighting, as Carl Douglas put it, but I don't know that that's associated with as clearly defined a group, say, as the ninja or as the samurai. So, yeah.
Hey, thanks, Rob. Oleg, do you want to take over? Maybe talk about the global dimension a little bit more? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe briefly respond to Paulina's mention of the kanji for samurai. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I mean is that we see the term being used in older sources. It's definitely there. It's definitely being used, but it's just in a different way than it is now. And I think we see that often just reflected. And again, this isn't in all cases, but we see a shift in the writing getting away from the kanji, which is often being used in quite specific instances in earlier documents. And then now, that we have most things are in katakana, or sometimes even in like Romaji. If you look at like Samurai Japan, the baseball team, that's usually written in Romaji. So I think with the popular narratives, it's a really difficult one because I think in teaching, but I mean, there's also something we were discussing with the exhibition is the popular narratives are useful to kind of get people in, but it's a really difficult balance to not then kind of reinforce those too much before you break them down. Because I find that sometimes, especially if I'm teaching things around Bushido, and I give various sources and like Nitobe Inazo's Bushido, for example, then even though we kind of break that down, sometimes students will just have that in their mind that, oh no, this is what it is. I mean, it's kind of hard to undo that sometimes, and it's a tricky one. But again, like I think Bushido is a really useful one for that because one thing is I wouldn't say that there is no samurai ethic or anything like that before the Meiji period. I certainly wouldn't say that. I mean, I think a case could probably be made. People have tried, I think, making a few cases. I haven't been convinced that there is like kind of a widely accepted thing there, but I'm very happy to be convinced. It's really difficult to prove that something didn't exist, as Rob also kind of points out there. But I think what's interesting is just to, especially with students, is to kind of go through these processes of kind of creation and invention and to look at what inspirations there are for certain interpretations. And And just as Rob mentioned with the ninja, some of these, kind of post-war films and other things where you can kind of say, oh, like this is where this thing comes from, this is where this thing comes from. I mean, I think we really see that with Bushido, where these things are coming from, you know, some elements of, especially in kind of late Meiji period, where some of this stuff is being taken from, Victorian ideals of chivalry and gentlemanship. This when Sam Smile's Self-Help is, one of the most popular books in Japan. And I think that's one of the things that, to get to Ron's larger question about the global and this being such a recognizable figure, which, I think the samurai are, I mean, they are kind of on par with the European knight. And a big part of that is because I think a lot of that construction of the samurai is going hand in hand with kind of the uses of and reinvention of the European knight in the 19th century. And these things are reflecting one another. I mean, and this is not just Japan, this is a lot of different cultures, but you have Japanese diplomats and missions and other things, starting with the Iwakura mission, traveling to the UK in the early 1870s. And, they're going to the heart of the most powerful empire in history, the most technologically advanced empire in history. And the queen is living in a medieval castle. And, they're celebrating knights. There's statues of, Richard the Lionheart in front of the medievalist houses of parliament. And so when you see that, you're like, oh, okay, well, it's the most modern thing, but they're celebrating this. And when you go back, you have a different view of your own history and start kind of looking at, samurai and castles and all of those things in quite a different way. And so I think it's not just from the Japanese perspective, it's not just this kind of emulation, like Japanese emulation of kind of like a Western stimulus, though, because this then goes the opposite direction as well. Because once this process of, I think, kind of recreation of a samurai image really starts happening in the 1890s, I think you get a lot of people in Europe, I mean, especially Britain and America, who are really getting into this and then buying into it. And, we see people there that are writing, oh, yeah, we used to have knights and chivalry, but we've lost all that. But the Japanese have managed to retain it. They are these great heroes. They still have this samurai spirit, and we've lost our own spirit of chivalry. We need to be more like the people in Japan. And so, these things are kind of bouncing back and forth. But I think it is this kind of synergy that we have between the European knight and the samurai that kind of helps those two kind of reach that level. I mean, the other figure I think that I would put in there is the American cowboy. And there's a lot of obviously connections between those in the 20th century through cinema and other things. So
Yeah, and we can talk about Kurosawa and cowboy films and what Lucas did or didn't steal for him for Star Wars. And I think what we get from all your points is that we need to remind our students, and I think that's what we get from it, that history is always about the present. And those figures, the ninja and the samurais, do a lot of the ideological work for us, either in the West or in Japan. Rob, for example, have this excellent Substack about ninjas and Anpo, like the ninja literature in the 60s and ninja as a working class hero, which it doesn't exist at all today because we're not in 1960s Japan, right? And we're not Japanese in 1960s, right? So I think those figures do different ideological and symbolic work for us, either now in Shogun or again 1960s Anpo.